Futurists try and extend thinking beyond the forecast, from the what is that we see behind us and in the present towards what if, what is possible. It could be more negative, could be more positive. This generation has had a few more disruptions and they are globally connected, so they can see unfairness across space and time. And that sort of really makes us question why we're doing the things that we're doing. Why should we study? Why should we go and work in a job that doesn't add any value to your own life? It's supposed to disrupt. It's supposed to cause chaos.
Yeah.
Right? So we shouldn't look at young people and say, shush.
Exactly.
Like, hey, fall in line. At the moment, our schools do still train children to get a job. But the truth is, they're not going to be jobs waiting for people. This younger generations, I'm talking specifically people kind of under the age of 30, have shown a greater propensity to get involved with active activism, not just armchair activism. This idea of a secure 9-to-5 lifestyle has to fall away. And I think that what a lot of younger people perhaps haven't fully realized is that the sort of security safety trade-off cuts both ways.
Hi everyone, welcome to Navigating the 20s. I am Zinhle Novazi, and in today's conversation, I have the privilege of having a conversation with Bronwyn Williams, a partner at Fluxtrends. In this conversation, we speak about future trends. We speak about different things that are happening around the world, particularly speaking about the youth. Why are we so perplexed with the choices that we have to make? Why are we struggling to commit? And why do we feel like we don't have a sense of agency? Beyond this, we speak about the meaning in life. How do you find self-identity? We speak through health. How are we making better decisions in terms of the data that is available to us? We speak about the election year, and we speak about advocacy, which is really at the heart of what you and I are passionate about. So if this conversation is for you, stay tuned in and let us know what you think about this episode. Bronwyn, thank you so much for joining us on the Navigating the 20s podcast. First of all, as you know, we are all about navigating the 20s, understanding what are the different insights and different perspectives we need to be aware of in order for us to flourish in our 20s. One of your titles is a futurist. So for people that are unfamiliar with what a futurist is, can you tell us what it is? Hopefully it's not like you helping us predict the lottery numbers for the jackpot or something like that.
Well, I think it's always helpful when trying to explain what we do as futurists to explain what we don't do. And I think that first of all, there's quite a big difference between my academic training, which is in economics, and then in futures or future studies, as we call what we do in the futures field. And essentially, like economists and politicians or policymakers do try and predict the future, don't they, right? They put out forecasts, which are usually based on targets, whether you're working in the public sector or the private sector. Those sorts of roles try and extrapolate data from the past to try and predict what the future is. And they can be quantitatively wrong or right, right? I mean, weather forecasters do the same thing. Really. Or epidemiologists, if you want to go back to COVID days, right? It's like looking at past data and trying to predict or model where we're going to end up. Futurists don't do that. Futurists try and extend thinking beyond the forecast, from the what is that we see behind us and in the present towards what if, what is possible. It could be more negative, could be more positive, but what happens if we deviate from what is forecast and we broaden our horizons? That's what future studies and foresight is all about. So we actually can't be wrong. We can't predict the future because we're just saying, what if? Yeah.
Actually, that's quite smart. And you mentioned there in your intro that you weren't traditionally trained in what you're doing. I've got it that you've got an economics background. How did you actually shift into the role that you're in now as a partner at Fluxtrends?
Well, I've always been interested in trying to extend across those stories. And we do know that forecasts seldom play out the way that we've planned, right? We know if whether you work in finance or whether you work in the weather, whatever it is, past performance is not a guaranteed indicator of future returns, as any sort of financial advisor will tell you straight up when you try and invest in a policy. And I think I've always been interested in trends and in what has happened, but also seeing what could happen in the future too. And once you've got that perspective, it becomes almost a bit of an addiction, right? To always like trying to go broader and to keep on zooming out on your perspective. But essentially, my background was in selling financial services products, particularly information-based products, so market research and analysis. And pretty soon, on selling some of the best financial insights in the country with the best economists and the best political economists, you start realizing, well, maybe I've got some ideas of my own, and maybe I'd like to explore them rather than just explore kind of selling the ideas of other people.
Sure.
And I did go get a degree in future studies. You can get postgraduate diplomas from the University of Stellenbosch, and you could do a PhD there if that's your bag. I would say that you don't need any sort of degree in order to be a futurist. Being a futurist is something that is natural to all human beings.
Sure.
It's like breathing. It's the best sort of analogy I can have. We do it anyway. You do it without thinking. When you get out of bed, you are forecasting your day. Your mood, of course, dictates how your day is going to progress.
Yeah.
You're thinking ahead all the time. We are prediction-based algorithms. When you look at the way our brains work, right? So we all do play in the world of the possible and the probable and the improbable.
Yeah.
But at the same time, not all of us do it as a full-time career, right?
Wow.
So
I think you by far have given the best definition of what a futurist does. I think you've simplified it beautifully. And I actually didn't think every day this analyzing that you're doing, your past data of what I did yesterday, what I want to do for tomorrow is actually engaging in like a futurist approach. But coming into that, one of the main concerns that people navigating their 20s worry about is the idea of self-discovery and identity. And I kind of want to pick your brain around this. I think we have evolved around just looking at sex, gender, sexuality, the idea and the construct of identities forever evolving. What are some of the trends around self-discovery and identity, and what can you tell us about how younger people are starting to identify?
Well, I think that I'm not even necessarily the best person to answer that question, but I do have a good friend who's also a professional futurist based in the UK called Tracy Follows, which is a great name for a futurist too. Yeah. But she wrote a book called The Future of You. And I think that I would point people to reading that if you do want to understand a lot of the identity crisis that we're undergoing, not just as people in your 20s or just starting out in life, but really in humanity at large, because our identity is no longer contained within ourselves or even within our societies. It's now also almost having a mirror effect with our digital lives too. Like, who are you? That sounds like a quite simple question, but are you your body?
Yeah.
Or are you your social media footprint?
Sure.
Are you the sum total of the things you've said and done, or are you the thoughts within your head? And this, of course, is also being challenged with the likes of Neuralink, which I'm sure many of you would have heard of with Elon Musk. But there's other things going on, like brain reading technology outside of your head, without putting chips inside your head. We can now predict with high degrees of accuracy, not like economists or weather forecasters predict the future, but with high degree of accuracy, what you are thinking in real time. We can decode thought into speech and thought into pictures, right? So that means, who am I in all that mess? Am I just an algorithm?
Sure.
Or am I the relationships that I have with people? Or am I this sort of fragmented, faceted body that lives both within a physical body and within the digital realm?
Sure.
So anyway, Tracy's work goes into this in a much greater detail.
Yeah.
But these are definitely sorts of conversations we do think about as futurists. And I think it's very difficult at today's point in time when we do live these very online lives where you can't really disconnect if you want to have a career, if you want to have a relationships, but then you always constantly trying to figure out which is the real me.
Yeah.
Are these pieces, am I the sum, am I a total that's greater than the sum of the parts?
Yeah.
Or are they multiple versions of me? Or do I even exist? Or am I just a part of the greater us, or the big I, as they say,
Sure.
right? It's a really deep question.
It is. Actually, when you speaking, you reminded me of Descartes, I think he's a French philosopher who spoke, for as long as I'm thinking, therefore I am. So when I cease to stop thinking, then I'm no longer in existence. And it makes me even wonder about, identities in the metaverse and so on. And I guess it boils down to what your personal definition of how you self-identify comes down into. And that gives you a more integrated approach to unlocking the question of who am I?
Well, this is why I think the conversations around the trans movement and around the LGBTQIA movements are so interesting, because these are movements that are challenging our identity in a physical sense, of course, as being fixed or fluid, right? And these are concepts that weren't even thought about prior, or they were on the fringes by philosophers, but now they're like mainstream constructs. I think the digital mirror is forcing us to have these conversations around me, I, who am I? Am I fixed or am I fluid?
Yeah.
Can my identity be malleable, or is it tied to my physical meat space?
Yeah.
Can I change it? can I change it? Like some people talk about this concept of like meat Lego, right? I can change my physical body to match the identity that I think I am. But what about all these fragmented parts of myself across the internet? Does the me reside just within me, or does it reside in my algorithmic chatbots that have mirrored who I am, that I'm now sending out to job interviews? Is that me?
Yeah.
Or is that an extension of me? Or is that like a clone of me, which is separate from me, right? But like these sorts of conversations are happening at certain levels, still at very physical levels, but they are pointing towards much deeper undercurrents of unsettlement that we have.
Yeah.
Because these are the reasons why we get up in the morning. These are the reasons why we have meaning in our lives. We know we are finite beings. We know we're going to die one day.
Yeah.
So questions of meaning and who I am and do I matter and can I extend who I am beyond my natural time frame are fundamental questions to anyone that's interested in the future. Because this is like fundamentally any question about the future comes down to sort of immortality or sustainability or how long does this party last?
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually, when I think about it further, it's going to be interesting long term, the more identities we embrace, how that changes like the workplace and policies for making people feel more included. And coming on to that, a lot of the people who are our listeners are in their 20s, they're young working professionals, they're entrepreneurs. What are sort of some of the trends that are happening in how the workplace is changing? Obviously, we had COVID that happened and we embraced a more hybrid working environment. What are some of the trends now that are happening post-COVID, and how can we be better prepared for how the workplace is changing?
Well, that's an interesting question because in some ways the workplace isn't changing at all, right? Because workplaces are places, right? They're not people, right?
Yeah.
And systems tend to be quite sticky to dismantle. But there is a whole lot of dismantling that's taking place in the world of work as in the world of politics at the moment. You can kind of see the center is not holding.
Yeah.
And I think this is why I start these conversations with like these very big existential crises, because that's the greater conversation. But the same conversation is taking place in the world of work at the moment, where people are saying, why am I doing this? Why am I part of this capitalist society? Why am I part of a democracy? What is a democracy? Why should I vote?
Yeah.
Why should I go to work at all? Why should I get on this treadmill? Why is society the way that it is?
Sure.
This is what's unraveling in the world of work at the moment. Like we see businesses not wanting to hire young people in their 20s.
Yeah.
At the same time, you see young people in their 20s not wanting to work in those offices. And that's fine, aside from the fact that what's the future of your organization then? If there is no organization, if there are no people, right?
Sure.
Like you can keep that going with our longer lifespans for like 40, 50 years, but then what, right?
Yeah.
This new cohort is not grafting into the system. And some of the reasons for that are the likes of COVID, which kind of disrupted, if I can say this, essentially our great global brainwashing system.
Yeah.
That is the schooling system that is designed to make young people fit in with the world. School's primary focus is not to just educate you. It's also to make you a citizen. In other words, to help you accept your society, how it works, and your place in it. And school was quite good at doing that for several generations. It sort of industrialized us and indoctrinated us into this idea of you get up every day, your future is tied to a time and a place. It's ruled by a school bell. You clock in, you clock out.
Yeah.
You have to be in place in classrooms. And then you're going to go do the same thing at work. And we kind of got habituated to that. And it worked very well for the capitalist globalist society, right?
Yeah.
That was the sort of neoliberal world order as people spoke about. And it was and we have to say that these systems were good at getting people out of poverty, at improving longevity, at all sorts of indicators of human flourishing. But of course, they came at a cost.
Yeah.
And quite an existential cost in that. Is greed just good? Is this all there is to life? Like getting a base job, getting the base mortgage, paying off the debt, making more money to take on more debt and going part of that system.
Yeah.
Which, as long as you're not disrupted, you can keep on playing that game, right? Because everyone else is playing it. But when you have like a great pause, like with COVID, when everyone was sent into lockdown, schooling system broke down, young people didn't complete their sort of training process for life, right? And they kind of saw what happened to their parents. They saw the instability in people's lives. Some people saw their families lose everything through no fault of their own. Others saw people getting very rich from doing nothing. And the sort of unfairness of the so-called fair meritocratic system has become so apparent to this generation. They are challenging whether they want to participate in it or not. And this is something that almost every generation has had crises over. But most of them have had their crises, had their protest season, and gone back to work.
Yeah.
This generation has had a few more disruptions, and they are globally connected. So they can see unfairness across space and time.
Sure.
not just historically, but they can see how other people are living in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of a general sense of unfairness and this whole sort of idea that zero-sum thinking has crept into this generation. That's the idea that we all play sort of adversarial games, that if I win, you lose. If I lose, you win. You know, like there's always a winner and a loser.
Yeah.
We're not in this together. We're quite divided. These are ideas that aren't necessarily real, but they're ideas that are felt with this generation through the way the world is working. And we just kind of saw over the last 3 years, thanks to the mirrors that are social media and that are global connected lives, that the screen had fallen down. If you ever remember the movie, The Wizard of Oz, the wizard was behind the screen and they all believed he was a great and powerful Oz. But then when the screen fell down, they could put the screen back up again, but the illusion was destroyed. Now we know it was a man. It wasn't a wizard, right? Yeah. And it's like there's sort of the sense that the fourth wall has fallen down in our sort of rat race society.
Yeah.
And even though we've put the wall back up, like, let's get back to work. You know, things are back to normal. Let's go make money, everybody. People have seen behind the wall and they no longer believe in the system and in the societies that they are supposed to support.
Yeah.
And that's the sense we're seeing with struggling with this generation, struggling to integrate into politics, not wanting to vote, not wanting to get onto voters' registrations, at the same time not wanting to have jobs that feel meaningless, that feel like you are just perpetuating a pointless system.
Sure.
We know so many of us do bullshit jobs. You know, we do jobs that are not essential. That was another thing COVID taught us.
Yeah.
Just how inessential most of us are. Isn't that a horrible thing to say?
Literally, if you're a non-essential worker, you don't matter.
Yeah,
in a time of crisis.
You've spent your whole life, maybe you saw your father spending 40, 50 years of his life doing a job that is not essential to society at all. It's like the make work that he was performing the act of working in order to collect the performance that is money, which is also made up, in order to perpetuate the lifestyle of striving, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, why are we doing this? Like nobody needs to move pictures around on a PowerPoint slide. We're not saving the world. You know? I speak to myself too, right?
Yeah.
Like, well, we're not part of it. And that sort of really makes us question why we're doing the things that we're doing. Why should we study? Why should we go and work in a job that doesn't add any value to your own life?
Yeah.
Your own finite life,
Yeah.
or to the future of the world that might actually, in fact, be antithetical to the sort of future that you want. And even if people haven't thought this out explicitly, implicitly, we all kind of have this sense that why are we doing these things that we're doing? And do we have to?
Sure. Bronwyn, geez, you touched on a lot of things. I'm going to go backwards. At the top of my mind, the lack of participation in society. For instance, like last week, I wrote an article on how the youth is not represented in the different parliaments across the world. I mean, in South Africa alone, we make up 9%. So do you also might see that the reason why the youth does not want to participate is that they're not represented in parliament, even in the decision-making spaces of corporates, that there's no one who's in tune with the youth's voice. So the change is coming slowly because it has to go through a mere representation of, let's say, 9% of the youth in parliament. So there needs to be more younger people in the decision-making seats.
Yeah, the sense of sort of apathy that we see generally comes. So that's what like critics of young people would say. They're apathetic. They like don't want to vote. They like just too lazy to get a job. And that's a very shameful way to look at it. Instead, you got to look at the reasons why people feel like they don't want to participate. Usually because people feel like their participation is either invalued, as you're saying, or that it makes no difference. In other words, that even if they exercise agency, they have no influence on the outcome. So what's the point in voting if the same guy is going to be in power next year? You don't have to look at South African politics. I think American politics is an even better example there because they literally got two old guys again that they're going to have to choose between. What's the point of money vote saying nothing changes, just the seesaw tilts a little bit from one side, from left to right, but I stay the same.
Exactly.
You know, like, why must I participate in a system that I can't influence? And that is a very dangerous thought. In fact, it's a thought that is tacitly endorsed by the incumbents. In other words, by elderly people in power, because guess what? As long as young people don't believe that they can do anything, young people don't do anything, and the old guard stays in charge. So that is my message to younger people, that you actually do not just have agency, you also do have influence, but those are gifts that you don't get. If you don't use them, you lose them.
Absolutely.
And you lose them in a compounding manner, because compound interest doesn't just apply to money, it applies to power and privilege too.
Yeah.
So I know it's hard. It's not a particularly encouraging. Maybe it is for some people, but maybe it's also like a bit demoralizing. Like it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Still, with this upcoming election, you might not like any of the 200 odd parties on the ballot. I mean, goodness knows we've got enough of them, but none of them have really new ideas.
Yeah, it's the same repeat, different name.
I get that. I understand that. But at the same time, if you don't vote, someone else does.
Absolutely.
You know, and they'll take your share. Their vote will have more influence than your non-vote will have, right?
Yeah.
You know, and this is the sense that we have to sort of get beyond apathy towards activism. And if systems are like blocking you out, what we also see with younger people, which is much more positive, is that young people are working, or positive or negative, much more big chaotic energy, disruptive energy.
Yeah.
Is that where young people don't feel like systems that are existing have space for them, they will work around systems. And I think that's perfectly legitimate.
Yeah.
Every generation should rebel against older generations. When we're young, we're supposed to challenge power. In fact, that's my tragedy with my generation as millennials, the 30s to 40-year-olds.
Yeah.
We didn't challenge authority. There was no millennial cultural revolution, was there? Think about it.
Except for June 1976, that was millennials.
No, like you had the youth revolutions, like you said, 1976 South Africa. You also had at the same time all the anti-Vietnam protests.
Yes.
That actually did change politics in history, that like swung politics in a very different direction.
Yeah.
Right? There seems to be a sort of sense, but anyway, now we're starting to see young people, if they can't work within systems, kind of working without them. And that does make sense, but also very dangerous and very destabilizing. And we see this in the macro trends, the likes of young people don't believe that democracy is essential. And even never mind the fact that in our country, our parents fought for that right.
Exactly.
Right? Died for that right. And now we're not like even prepared to register to vote. And even if we do vote, we're not necessarily seeing that democracy, as flawed as it is, might still be better than the other alternatives that are out there, right? So you see democracy backsliding, not for reasons we can't understand, but also perhaps because we haven't unthought through what the alternatives can be, right? Like, you know, so it's a really hard conversation, but I understand completely why young people would want to be agents of chaos, want to engage in anarchy, want to engage in apathy, you know, or want to engage in activism on the more sort of, you know, proactive side, which are the three macro trends we've definitely been tracking with younger people, kind of falling into those three streams, which are sort of range from the more constructive to the more kind of destructive. But they all point to the fact that the system's not working for young people. And unfortunately, this generation is also seeing the sort of downstream effects of population change, the change in our population pyramid shapes, to having more old people that are more over 35s, under 35s globally. You know, old people are living for longer, and power does tend to stay with the powerful, like Matthew effects. Wealth accumulates more to the wealthy. You know, power accumulates power. So the longer you stay alive, the more wealthy and more powerful you're likely to be. I mean, this is why vampires are always rich, like vampire stories. Right? You have a longer time to compound.
Exactly.
So as we have older people staying in power and staying cognitively, at least, quote unquote, aware for longer. You know, that you're not getting that handover of power and money at a younger age. In other words, the age of when people are still hungry. People are still pushing for power and for change. Because I mean, like us millennials are already getting to the age where, you know, new technology is like, oh, that's for the kids. Like, I don't want to roadblock.
You don't know what?
Children. You know? We're already getting to the age where, you know, adopt new ideas that we just accept the world the way it is. So
absolutely.
This time for change is such a precious short time in any sort of generational handover. And if all the generations can block that youthful energy for long enough that you have 80 and 90-year-olds in power, you can see how youth gets lost and how fees must fall movements translate into nothing. Did fees fall?
No, they're still there.
How about the Arab Spring? Like,
no,
you know, like the same guys in charge. You know, You know, like that's if you don't actually have that handover of power, it effectively neuter the cyclical effect that youth is supposed to have in society. Youth is supposed to disrupt. It's supposed to criticize elders. It's supposed to cause chaos. Right? So we shouldn't look at young people and say, shush. You know, like, hey, fall in line. We should embrace that because that's how societies remain vital. That's how evolution works in the wild, this idea of conflict and collaboration. But you have to have the conflict. But the conflict has to take, otherwise society does become sterile. And that's what we see, very literally. That's why young people aren't having babies. They don't. That's the ultimate vote of not wanting to vote. Right? Not abstaining from your vote in the future. That's the ultimate vote. Anti-vote.
Jeez.
And like literal abstinence.
We will literally come to that part. But when you're speaking about disrupting, especially within organizations, what is the solution now? Or let me start it backwards. Let's start with the schooling system. Now that young people are not let me say, programmed to become citizens of society because that system has been disrupted. What does that mean for formal education around the world? And then secondly, how do then corporates deal with the fact that not millennials, Gen Zs or Gen Zs that are coming in want more meaning, more purpose, and they're not going to fall into the trap of, I'm going to work a job because I have to bring money. Like that's not enough anymore.
Well, I think a sort of trite, oversimplified answer is where we're heading is to more value-based exchanges rather than more time-based exchanges, right?
Yeah.
So separating time and place from our value and contribution to society or to an organization or to a company or to your family, whatever that might be, right?
Yeah.
So sort of separating that and making sure that we focus on value. At the moment, our schools do still train children to get a job. But the truth is they're not going to be jobs waiting for people. We've already seen companies saying they don't want to hire young people.
Yeah.
What are they replacing that with? Well, it's a combination of automation and freelancers and remote workers and, call centers out of the cheaper countries in the East.
Yeah.
There's a combination of things that are being replaced there. This idea of a secure 9-to-5 lifestyle has to fall away. And I think that what a lot of younger people perhaps haven't fully realized is that the sort of security safety trade-off cuts both ways.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you can demand freedom from society. But at the same time, you have to understand you're also then giving up security, which means you have to step up and be more responsible for yourself.
Yeah.
And you have to fight and prove every day that you are adding value.
Sure.
Whereas the salaried life, you gave away your freedom.
Yeah.
You gave away your time-based freedom. You gave away your location-based freedom.
Yeah.
But in exchange for your little gilded cage, you knew when you were going to be fed by your master, right?
Yeah.
Very different equation that you were trained to aspire to, right? Yeah. But you've seen how that cage, as much as it is a cage, the cat can still get its claw inside.
Absolutely.
You can still get hurt.
Yeah.
Even though you've given away all your freedoms, you're not getting that exchange.
Yeah.
And that sort of contract breakdown, incidentally, is very similar at the national level. Like, again, we give up freedoms to be part of a society.
Yeah.
We pay our taxes. We agree to obey the rules. Some of the rules we don't agree with, but we have to agree with them or you go to jail.
Yeah.
But in exchange, you still expect to be looked after by your government, right?
Yeah.
You expect, your grant, you expect your pension one day, you expect healthcare, you expect education, you expect the potholes in the roads to be filled in rather than be turned into like competition gardens, gardens as they are now. But when that breaks down, we lose trust in our state, the same way we lose trust in the companies that we want to work for if they're not fulfilling both sides of those equations.
Yeah.
So the future does seem to be that you are more on your own, but you have more freedom.
Yeah.
And freedom can be paralyzing, much like with the identity question.
Yep.
You can be anyone. You can be the dog on the internet. Like the old adage, anyone could be a dog on the internet. Well, you really can.
Yeah.
But is that what you want? This infinite choice comes with like infinite sort of complexity.
Sure.
Right? So it's very hard to choose what you want to do, where you want to be, without anyone kind of telling you what's going to happen. So more sort of insecurity, more self-guided career journeys or career portfolios you're speaking about now. All these sort of trends are kind of colliding.
Yeah.
Again, very scary on the one hand, but quite exciting on the other. It's a much more human kind of future, ironically, that the technologically, algorithmically driven automated world is forcing us to sort of reconnect with, which is, as you said, like a huge identity crisis that we're seeing. At the same time, companies, we do see quite a lot of them doubling down on the old ways of work. And if you are a 60, 70-year-old CEO sitting on a board, that makes total sense for you because quite frankly, you're going to be dead before the sort of bottom of the pyramid caves in, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about fulfilling jobs and vacant seats and sales professionals, 30 years down the line, because that's not your problem.
Absolutely.
And that's, of course, the challenge that organizations have, the inability to prepare for the future when the most powerful people in your organizations, the decision makers, have the shortest time horizon. Again, same thing with politics.
Yeah.
And do you think Biden or Trump or any of our politicians here in South Africa, Cyril, do you think he cares about the 30-year consequences of the policies that they're putting in place now?
I actually think somebody suggested that we should have a retirement age for politicians in parliament because of that exact dilemma. Yeah.
Well, some of the sort of solutions we're seeing, again, organizational and state level, which is always nice to see. The important trends tend to be fractal like that. They the same patterns play out at different scale.
Yeah.
Is we are seeing companies that do want to last longer than the oldest guy on their board. They are investing in things like shadow boards, where
Yeah.
you bring the youngest employees in the organization into the most important meetings in the organization to learn and to listen and to share.
Yeah.
Because quite often, old people do have things to teach young people.
That's true.
But because we've been so cut out of these things, we've got these generational divides. And at the same time, old people definitely have things to learn from young people if they want to survive. in the future, or if
Absolutely.
they want their ideas or their legacy to progress
Yeah.
beyond their natural lifespan. I said, all the big important trends tap into immortality. If you want to get people on your side, show them how this will last longer than they will, right? So what's your
Absolutely.
legacy?
What's the succession plan?
Exactly, succession.
Yeah.
And then at the state level, again, we're seeing really interesting projects like several parliaments across the world now have these sort of citizen assemblies.
Yes,
Which
yes.
are not elected bodies. They're rather like jury duty. You get lottery called up for like, say, going to be conscripted in the army. You get called up to join the citizen assembly for a term, whether it's 6 months or a couple of years. And then you as a random citizen of voting age get to participate in shaping policy.
Sure.
As not as elected politicians, but quite often those citizen assemblies have a future mandate. So they have a lot younger people than you would have in political elected to office seats.
Yeah.
And quite often they have the mandate of challenging policy within a 50 or 100-year time frame. Like Japan has those. They call them they time lords is their sort of nickname, badly translated. And they wear like yellow jackets and they get together and their job is to challenge policy put out by politicians to protect the future. So like it's not all bad out there, but these sorts of signals or seeds of what the future could look like show that, collaboration and try to stretch that perspective and extend that long now from the constant present that we're in can be a much more wholesome and much more productive way to sort of look at overcoming organizational and societal challenges.
Absolutely. And whilst we're still on that macro level, what has been, particularly this year with Israel and Palestine, what has been some of the trends around young people and using technology, social media to advocate for change? Are we seeing this being different from former years where young people took to social media?
Yeah, I would say, but like, again, this younger generations, I'm talking specifically people kind of under the age of 30, have shown a greater propensity to get involved with active activism, not just armchair activism. That is quite a big distinction from protest culture towards sort of actually participative culture. And there's great examples of young people all across the world, like getting elected into Senate when you're still a teenager in America. Credible, like you're not even your 21st birthday and you're like running for office here in South Africa, right? So like young people are actually doing things and putting more on the line than perhaps previous generations did. There is kind of the sense of urgency and importance, and the sense that the sensor cannot hold. So we kind of have to do something now.
Yeah.
So the activism in this generation, when you're talking about environmental issues, whether you're talking about gender issues, whether you're talking about political issues, that's been one of the more encouraging things to see. Although again, that activism can tend towards anarchy and destruction if it's not harnessed by the so-called system, whether you like the system or not, right? So this is the debate between people talking about the future of technology, like accelerationists, burn it all down, we can do better. Or people saying, wait a minute, there's some stuff that's kind of worth preserving. Right? Yeah. And that's the danger of societies to refuse to listen to young people, is that productive energy that can breathe new life into society, that can keep it vital, that can keep the dead wood out and keep the new shoots growing, can turn into just like, destructive fire instead if it's ignored, or if it's stifled, or if it's not embraced by the incumbents.
And then Bronwyn as well, this year is they're calling it election year because I think over 60% of different countries around the world are all holding elections this year. What are some of the things that we can expect or look out for with election year coming up?
Yeah, so again, I want to put them in those sort of three streams of apathy, anarchy, activism. We're kind of seeing this. On the sort of apathy side of things, this youth voter apathy is not just a South African phenomena. It's also happening in the US too, for all the reasons we've discussed. Yeah. So we can expect a lot of young people to not cast their vote. And that taps into the other stream, the anarchy stream that I'm talking about, the more destructive theme. Because for every young person's not putting their vote in, that means that the extremists who do have a point of view are now being outsized weighted in electorates. Sure. And we see this with the rise of populist parties, left and right, but particularly populist parties that have an ethno-nationalist flavor. Sure. So that can be left-wing or right-wing ethno-nationalist. Yeah. Unfortunately, I have been speaking about this quite a lot. It's not one of the nicest things with younger generations, but unfortunately, ethno-nationalism is a thread we see across Africa, across Europe, across the US. And it's one of those things that we have to watch because we know what happened last century with ethno-nationalism. Like look at all the wars across the world. They're all based on ethno-nationalism. Yeah. Not on shared values, not on shared ideals, but on about very superficial grouping mechanisms that people who don't feel like they have a place in society that might be more violently inclined might want to join into, as opposed to those who just give up. Yeah. And the people that give up tend to be more of the pacifists, right? This is this unfortunate thing with human nature. Yeah. So my message is, if you are feeling apathetic and demoralized about the future of the world, well, guess who's happy to vote on your behalf, right?
The people we don't want to vote on our behalf.
The ones who say, who cares about democracy? We'll take an authoritarian leader any day. Those are not the apathetic. Those are the ones that are going to vote for perhaps the sort of futures that you don't necessarily want to live the consequences thereof. Yeah. And it's worth pointing out that the world is in absolute tenterhooks at the moment. We've seen everything from Australia through to the UK putting out notices that people must be prepared to be conscripted.
Yeah, that was scary.
Right? Yeah. But I called this quite early on when we heard rumors of Russia invading Ukraine. This idea that hot war was behind us. Yeah. The history had ended, and it clearly hasn't, right? And I think that's also something to think about when we think about our futures, particularly as young people, is many of the conversations you have about the future are hypothetical. What ifs? What if the robots take over? What if there's a singularity? Yeah. What if the economy does this or that? And all these sorts of very intangible things. But at the end of the day, the most important things in your life are literally your life, right? Absolutely. And when push comes to shove, it's the very basic needs, the needs for physical connection, protecting of your family, safety and security in a very literal sense, not just in a financial sense, are the most important things worth protecting. Yeah. So even when you feel sort of desperately unhappy about the more superficial unfairnesses in our society, and I know that economic unfairness is hard, I would still prefer that to all-out warfare. Yeah, right? For me, I speak for myself.
No, you're not the only one.
Maybe you're an anarchist accelerationist, but as for me, I think that there are sort of different levels of discomforts and different levels of where perhaps we need to engage in a little bit of foresight. So anyway, that's enough preaching for me.
Sure, that actually brought my mind, because I think I actually saw a few reels from people in the UK also saying I'd rather then move to a different country than have to be on the firing line if we're going to war. Kind of stuff. They're saying TikTok, imagine the TikTok generation holding a weapon. We're probably going to make a dance out of it. So it's quite funny.
Did you not see the dances from
Oh, goodness. I have to go back.
The Chinese military on the border conflict they have with India. It's another one of those massive fault lines between the two most populous nations in the world out in the Himalayas. They've got an ongoing border dispute, and the Chinese army was putting out TikToks and synchronized TV. So it's very surreal. Yeah. It feels superficial because we see it through our cameras, but still there are real people that are literally being killed by killer drones. Yeah. Now, while we're having this conversation,
it's absurd.
We take for granted sometimes the safeties and the luxuries that came with a lot of the trade-offs that we gave to be part of society. Yeah. And I think it's always worth kind of thinking both sides of the ledger. I'm not here to tell you what to think or what to do, but I'm going to ask you to think through the consequences of getting what you want.
Sure. Yeah, because it comes at a certain price.
It comes at a price either way you look at it. You've always got to, that's the same thing with making choices for your life. What career you're going to do, whether you're going to have a career, whether you want to be a homemaker or have a career, or whether you want to work in this job or that job or study this or that. Yeah. It's all going to be hard. You just got to choose what sort of hard do you really want. But again, if you're going to be apathetic about the choice, someone else is going to make that choice.
Absolutely.
And you should also have your vote in the pile. Yeah. Very literal and a figurative sense.
If you are listening to this podcast now, I would encourage you to take to the polls. Don't just register and not vote, do both. And Bronwyn, coming back to your earlier point about young people abstaining, why is that problematic? Somebody might say, actually, we have too many people in the world in any case. So if young people aren't having children, minus one problem less, a less populated world.
Well, that's again a question of what your values are, right? Questions of having children are about values, not necessarily about prices, right? But at the same time, if you were to look at it from an economist point of view or political point of view, the number of people that you have, generally in the past, more was better, right? Because more people meant more growth. Yeah. Maybe that's not going to be the case in the future. Again, past performance, no guarantee of future returns. But the reality is our systems, again, our economic systems have been set up premised on the idea that there'll be more people in the future.
Yeah.
And the sort of systems I'm talking about are the very expensive systems like national healthcare. I know we don't have NHI here in South Africa yet, but we do actually technically have national healthcare.
Yeah.
Like it's in the Constitution. Like if you go to hospital, someone's going to have to treat you. We don't have it at the same scale as private healthcare, but we already have these entitlements. You know? So whether you're talking about that or healthcare education, old age pensions, grants, again, South Africans should really pay attention because so many of us are dependent on grants or some sorts of state entitlement that I've sort of spoken through there. But all those systems are funded basically on optimism, on future, on the idea that future generations will pay for current expenditure.
Sure.
So you kind of got these sort of like this sort of hand-on game. That's not quite a Ponzi scheme, but it becomes a Ponzi scheme when we start having babies because then we've effectively, us working now, are paying for people who are older than us, like ahead of the queue.
Yes.
And the people in their 20s are going to pay for us, but like who's going to pay for them if no one's having any babies? Again, that's a choice. We could say degrowing is what we want to do and we consciously want to make ourselves smaller, but we're going to understand that that's going to come at a material cost.
Sure.
It's also a question of values. Like what do we value? Do we value at a micro level our living standards that we have right now more than we value the idea of a legacy again in the flesh and blood? That's a very personal question. I cannot answer that for you. But I can look at revealed evidence and revealed preference. And that's the fact that more people are choosing not to have children. In other words, more people value other things other than having and making children more than they value having children.
Sure.
And that's not a judgment. That's just a statement of fact. We can choose, and we are lucky enough, us generation of women, to be able to choose.
Absolutely.
You know? So
to have
a choice. Having a family now is a choice, and therefore choosing not to have family is also more and more a choice. I mean, there are more and more credible medical breakthroughs that can allow people to have, people that would have wanted but can't, to have, much like our identity questions again. We can choose, we have so much more choice. But then again, our values are reflected in our choices, not just in what we state, but also in what we do. So there's lots to unpack there. But again, not a judgment at all, just a sort of observation that our values do seem to have shifted, but that is going to come at a material cost.
Absolutely. Is there something that propelled the shift? Because it was that the numbers went down, but many people were speculating that it was COVID, but now we've recovered from that. Has that tremendously changed family life, the nature of relationships, and our ability to want to procreate?
Probably not as much as we make it out to be. COVID just was interesting sort of case study because everyone was literally locked down. We were kind of like lab rats in this global machine. But the shift to not having children is a much longer trend. I think the other thing to be aware of, though, in the shift to not more people not having children, particularly educated women not having children, as educational attainment goes up in female populations, birth rates go down because women now have choices. You know, you've got different ways to store your value. You can store it in your bank account, or you can store it in your future children, right?
Yes.
You can do these things. You play different bets with your endowments, if you want to use very economic terms. But that pattern's been global. But what's interesting is that when it comes to population dynamics, we can say that, again, our choice not to have children means somebody else's children are going to have an outsized impact on the future, right? And this is the way populations do ebb and flow, both in the wild and in sort of human captivity, as our societies are right now. And that is that although certain societies, particularly closed-off societies who don't encourage immigration, who want to isolate themselves, there's several examples across sort of the planet we can go into, they are likely to literally die out. I mean, if birth rates get below a woman having 2.2 children each, you know, it only takes a couple of generations before that population is mathematically down to like zero, right? I mean, it's like halves very dramatically. You know, if all the women stop having babies tomorrow, there'll be no more people. But there are always some people that do want to have children, right? And those are sort of people, if their children also want to have children, populations can grow again. So these things are not static. These are dynamic curves. And if you've ever played around with like the computer games that the early futurists are so into, like the game of life, you can see how very small changes to the equation and a surplus here or a decrease here can have such wide-ranging chaos effect sort of streams. But still, the point is that when it comes to having children, the people that are going to have children are going to have more say over the future.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to relationships, dating and marriage, are there any changes there? Like are more younger people choosing not to get married, or are we seeing that hasn't been disrupted at all?
Marriage has also been on the decline, but marriage has to be understood as first and foremost a religious institution that was then formalized by the state.
Yeah.
And again, the state is a very artificial entity. Marriage is still a good economic choice, particularly if, for tax reasons and for inheritance reasons and all these sorts of, there's also the material benefits or incentives to getting married. Again, governments put a lot of incentives into having families too. Again, tax rebates, sometimes direct cash payments, all the rest of it. But the encouraging sort of thing when it comes to both marriage and children, that state policy is hugely ineffective at altering people's behavior in either of those regards.
That's actually true, because even in the past, before, we didn't recognize. Exactly.
The state has tried very hard to influence family dynamics, but people do what they want to do when it comes to their own lives.
Absolutely.
Women don't have babies, they don't want to have babies. Doesn't matter, the government is bribing you with like a free house in South Korea. So like, I don't want to do that. You can't make me, right?
Exactly.
At the same time, it's very similar with marriage. But marriage has trended down along with sort of the general religious decline, particularly in the West. That's not necessarily going to continue. As I did say, like this whole shift with the young generation Z, the more extremist types that are tending towards more populist, also often tend towards more conservative family values. So you've kind of got this rebellion against free love, which is always interesting how the pendulum swings. So we are seeing this sort of like resurgence on the fringes of signals and trends towards like traditional conservative sort of values and home-based values, which do suit men.
Yes,
much,
probably.
Right? Like, I mean, you understand why. And then women tend to do what men want because women want men and men want women.
Yeah,
like
vicious cycle.
We have these recursive equations. Nothing is ever static, and all trends have their sort of the seeds of their own destruction in it. So we could very well see a resurgence of marriage. One of the sort of trends to watch there is that up until last year, Generation Z, that would be the cohort, as we said, like from teenage up till 30-ish, just as a sort of broad heuristic there, they were not having sex. Like 60-year-olds are having more sex than 16-year-olds. But the sex recession seems to be over now. So
what caused that? I remember there was all over like, men aren't having sex and this is a problem. Young people aren't having sex.
Women didn't want it. Like all these sorts of things. Well, partly I think you just grow up and get quite lonely, right? And eventually even women are like,
I'll give in.
Okay. Maybe my standards are too high. I mean, that's oversimplifying it a lot. But also the social patterns change, right? So these sorts of things do come and go. This generation did find it harder to make physical relationships, having so many of their relationships primarily online. Right? So relationships, again, like the identity thing, have been disembodied for large cohorts of generations, right? It's a bit different when you get a bit older and you start to have relationships with co-workers that you might want to progress into something else and all the rest of it. But it does seem like that page has turned for whatever reason. Like we're kind of out of lockdown mindset. Kind of and like real physical contact is quite nice.
Which is promising. Yes, we want more people having sex, not necessarily procreating.
And like, having experiencing the fullness of human relation.
Absolutely. And whilst we're still dealing with the individual, I always say I belong to a cult because I always keep this on. Coming to health data and telematics, or have there been any recent changes in health data, and what insights can we grab from that? Like, are people still progressively analyzing their health data? Have there been any changes in that?
Well, that is one of the trends that is continuing. Absolutely. They've also got like the extremes of sort of biohacking and biotracking and self-analysis can like end up being like eating disorders. You could be healthy and then it can get unhealthy. But we've also seen them popularized by the likes of, the billionaires who want to live forever and invest a lot of money in, like Brian Johnson, a lot of the very expensive life-enhancing treatments that are all tied on to biohacking. But I mean, like that becomes a full-time job, right? It's all about how much of it is worth it, what's the marginal returns to how much effort we're putting on. But this idea that we can track things, we probably will, makes economic sense. Whether you're a state that's trying to provision national healthcare, or whether you're an insurer that's got to fund this sort of stuff, this sort of information is materially of value to organizations as well as to individuals. And of course, the more you know, the more you can do with things. So, like with these trends are not likely to go anywhere as we can sense more and track more and trace more. We're going to want access to that. It's not just to track and trace though, that's a sort of precursor. The precursor, what follows on is then using that information to transform.
Absolutely.
Whether it's to change the way your body works or the way your body looks, or how long you're going to live, all of these things. That's the thing. So tracking is the short sort of cycle. The longer cycle is very much the transformation cycle. And that gets very quickly back into sort of transhumanism and both aesthetic and biological changes that we can start playing with them.
Yeah, and I think it can also be important to inform like health policies. I mean, I think last year there was a big rave around the Blue Zone documentary on Netflix and how you can, like Singapore, I think was one of the examples that can manipulate the environment so that it causes people to lead and live healthier and longer lives. Yeah. But we are seeing that we're having less and less blue zones. So we don't know whether that can still be regenerated again. So in terms of one of the other changes that has been happening, I guess, continuously over a long time is that more and more people, young people, are finding jobs that allow them to embrace a nomadic lifestyle where they become digital nomads and they can operate from anywhere. So Bronwyn, how's our concept of being home changing, especially if we're embracing a more digital nomad lifestyle where we're not tied to our country or where we were born, where we're free to explore other countries and work from anywhere else?
This is very close to the question of identity, which is becoming fragmented in the digital space. It's also being fragmented, as you said, in the geographic space. It's sort of untethering from space and time, which is, again, quite freeing. It means that you've got this freedom. You're not like tied to any place. Tying has these sort of negative connotations. But at the same time, the concept of home is all about your ties, whether it's the people or the places or whatever it is that you are tied to that makes you you, right? So your idea of home, whether it be a physical space or a more sort of intellectual or spiritual place or church or sort of spiritual sort of grouping, whatever it is, when that sort of becomes disconnected from your identity, it can be a very, very lonely existence. And this, I think, is really a question of loneliness, particularly among younger generations. We kind of spoke about sex recession. We talk about how people are now finding each other again. Because there is this sense that the ties that bind us are also the ties that make life worth living. But of course, there's sort of extremes to these things. It's never like a binary yes or no, what's the best, or we should go all in freedom or all in sort of safety and security and control and all the rest of it. There's usually a sort of balance to be found there, right? Yeah. But we kind of do need some sense of stability in order to anchor who we are, in order to find our identity. You read those books about women running away to go find themselves. You never find yourself like on the road, right? No. You kind of find yourself when you realize where it is that you want to go back to. And that's a really hard question to answer. But given the world of opportunities, like I was speaking about, you've got so much choice. Doesn't matter where you go. You've got so many people that you can connect with. I mean, digital social networks mean that you don't have to have romantic relationships with people in your same country. In fact, not even with your same species. You can have an AI boyfriend like the girls in China are doing, right? You can do that, right? You can go do that. You can go you've got all these choices. But at the same time, you don't find fulfillment until you've made a choice. And I think that making choices is probably one of the hardest things for the current generation to deal with. Sure. And that's why so often we defer our ability to make choices to others, either by opting out, by not voting, by not participating, by not choosing, or by actively outsourcing our choice to something else, whether that be an algorithm, like let the Tinder gods decide who I should date next, so I don't have to go out and actually sort of make that choice myself, right? Sure. Or whatever the case is. So we try and limit that because choice is so overwhelming. I think that's the sort of question we need to think about with these sort of the ability to live anywhere and to embrace these freedoms, which are all wonderful things. The question is sort of where are you going to? Why are you going? Yeah. And why are you doing? Why do you feel the need? Do you have to keep going? What's what are you looking for? And these are very deep questions. Yeah. But these are questions that are best addressed head on with yourself in your bathroom and in front of your mirror or whatever when you're younger, rather than when you wake up when you in your 60s, like a lot of our parents did. Lockdown, were sort of stuck with themselves and their thoughts for 3 years. But when you don't have quite as much choice ahead of you, because that's the thing with choices. If you don't make them, ultimately you end up losing them, right?
Absolutely.
It's only by taking the choice that you're able to make the next one. So the sort of idea of life deferred is, I think, very tied to the idea of nomadic living, because it's a way not to make a choice. Sure. Like when you connect with someone, when you get married, when you buy a house, when you plant roots, you're losing out on choices, but then you are getting the depth and the richness, right? Yeah. But there's the idea that I don't want to put down roots because there could be a better place that I could do this later. But there's only so long you could do that without missing out on that experience altogether. So it's a quantity quality equation.
Sure.
Always choices, always trade-offs.
You put it so well, because I think our generation does suffer from a paralysis of choices, whether it is swiping on Tinder where you don't commit because there's so many options out there, and is the one that I'm settling for, could there be a better one? And same with like buying a property or settling down or choosing where to root yourself. There's always been a lot of data around how we're the loneliest group, or let me say population of people living, but yet we're so interconnected. Is that changing, or is that there to stay, that people are still getting lonelier even though they're so digitally connected?
Well, I think it's very much like the case of you're not lonely when you commit, right?
Yeah.
That's when you have real relationships that sort of fulfill you, right? I mean, like, you know, this, you can have meaningless sex with many strangers on Tinder, and it'll sort of fulfill your needs in the short term, but it will never fulfill the deeper human needs that you actually have for connection, or rest of it, right? So
that's actually a great point. I can't even add on. I think you answered that question straight on. And Bronwyn, thank you so much for all the incredible insights. In closing, we usually have a tradition where we ask the guests to give our listeners 3 pieces of advice on how to navigate the 20s.
Well, I think you need to read more. So I think you need to especially engage with reading people who you wouldn't necessarily like their ideas superficially, right? So read all the books by all the people that you find most repulsive in history, and then make up your own mind. To a very similar end, as a second piece of advice, I think that you should speak to people face to face. Again, people that you would feel uncomfortable talking to, right? So form real relationships, not necessarily romantic ones, but form relationships, talk to people, and get as broad a perspective as possible. And then, as much as I've said that, you know, you need to actually commit at some point to sort of settling down somewhere, to committing to whatever it is going to give your life meaning, rather than just sort of drifting aimlessly throughout whatever time you got here. I do think your 20s is a time to travel. And again, traveling doesn't have to mean going on the most expensive planes to the most exotic places. It could just mean traveling in your own bedroom, as Alain de Botton says so beautifully in his book, The Art of Travel. Like by exploring the area around you, sort of figuring out what's going on there, explore your neighborhood, explore your country. And if you've got the means, by all means, go see what's going on around the world. But don't go as a tourist, to go as someone who's there to learn and to see the truth beyond the facade, beyond the brochure, right? Because I think what a lot of people, particularly South Africans, have this idea that we kind of stuck on the bottom of the world, very literally. We're so far away from everything, so far behind from everything, that the grass is so much greener elsewhere. And I think it's only by traveling to other places, and as I said, speaking to people who live there, not tour guides who are there to point out all the fancy buildings, but people, seeing how people live in other places, and seeing that perhaps it's not, you know, the place that you were fallen might actually be the best place to end up to. But you can never go home until you figured out where it is that you want to go back to, right?
Thank you so much. And this brings us to the end of our podcast session with Bronwyn. If you loved that conversation, you can touch base with us on social media. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, obviously. So we would love to hear your views if you would like to comment or engage with us in terms of the conversation we had today. Don't forget to rate us on your podcast platform. We are at Navigating the 20s. Until next time, keep navigating, and it's been wonderful being with you for today.